The night before my first bundling, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed in the dark, staring at the wooden beams above me, listening to the wind push against the farmhouse walls. My younger sister was breathing slowly beside me. She was already somewhere peaceful in her dreams. I was wide awake. My heart would not settle. I kept trying to remember everything my mother had told me about what was going to happen, which was nothing. She had told me absolutely nothing. I was 17 years old. His name was Samuel, and in less than 24 hours, he would be climbing through the dark up the stairs of my family's house and lying down beside me in that very bed, with my parents' blessing, with the community's approval, with generations of tradition behind him, and I had no idea what I was supposed to do when he got there. My name is Martha. I was raised Old Order Amish. I left years ago. There are things I can talk about now that I never could have spoken aloud back then. This is one of them. Most people outside the Amish world have never heard of bundling. The few who have usually imagine something very different from what it really was. They hear the word and assume it was romantic, or strange, or harmless. The truth is more complicated, like many things in Amish life. What the outside world doesn't see is that many Amish traditions are carried by silence, not explanations, not conversations. Silence. You learned by watching. You learned by obeying. You learned by not asking too many questions. The Ordnung guided almost every part of our lives. The Ordnung was not a book. It was a set of unwritten rules. Everybody knew them. Nobody explained them fully. You simply learned where the lines were, and what happened if you crossed them. In our community, a girl was expected to become a wife one day, a mother, a keeper of a home. That future was spoken about as naturally as the weather, not as a possibility, as a certainty. I knew how to bake bread before I was a teenager. I knew how to sew. I knew how to preserve vegetables for winter. I knew how to wash clothes by hand until my fingers cracked from cold water. But nobody taught me about my own emotions. Nobody taught me about attraction. Nobody taught me what happened when a young man sat close enough for you to feel the warmth coming from his shoulder. Those things lived in shadows. I remember the first time Samuel caught my attention. It wasn't dramatic. There was no music, no sudden realization. It was during a Sunday singing. The benches were crowded. Young people filled the room. The air smelled like wool coats drying from melted snow. Someone was leading hymns, the slow Amish hymns that seemed to stretch forever. I noticed Samuel across the room. That was all. A glance. Nothing more. Months later, word reached me through cousins that he wanted to come calling. That was how things happened. Very little happened directly. Messages traveled through other people. Nothing was spoken to openly. When my mother told me Samuel planned to visit, she said it while folding laundry. She did not look up. She did not explain anything. She simply said his name. Then she kept folding. I waited for more. There was no more. That was the conversation. I wanted to ask questions, thousands of them. What am I supposed to say? What if I feel uncomfortable? What if he tries to kiss me? What if I don't like him? What if I do? Instead, I stayed quiet. Because girls who ask too many questions sometimes receive looks, and Amish girls learn very early how to read looks. The evening finally arrived. I remember every detail. The smell of supper still lingering in the kitchen, the sound of dishes being stacked, the creak of boots near the door, the lantern light reflecting off the windows. Outside, darkness settled over the fields. Inside, everything felt normal. Except me. Nothing felt normal inside me. After evening chores, I changed into my sleeping clothes, then changed again, then changed back. I did not know what was expected. I did not know if there even was an expectation. I only knew I felt nervous, the kind of nervous that makes your stomach feel hollow. When the house finally grew quiet, I climbed into bed. The blankets felt heavier than usual. Every sound seemed louder. The ticking clock downstairs, the wind, the distant movement of horses in the barn. Then I heard boots outside. Just for a moment, my entire body went still. Nobody had prepared me for that feeling. The awareness that someone was coming specifically to see me. Not my family, not my father, not my brothers. me. A soft knock came at the door. 2 gentle taps. I swallowed hard. "Come in." My voice sounded strange to my own ears. The door opened. There he was, Samuel. Tall, quiet, carrying cold air into the room. I remember the smell of winter on his coat, the smell of leather, the faint smell of hay. He nodded. I nodded back. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then he sat carefully on the edge of the bed, as nervous as I was, maybe more. That surprised me. I had imagined he would know exactly what to do. Boys seemed confident from a distance. Up close, they were often just as uncertain. Eventually, he lay down beside me, on top of the quilt, leaving space between us, a careful amount of space, enough to follow the rules, enough to acknowledge the situation. The silence felt enormous. I could hear my own breathing. I could hear his. I remember thinking that no sermon had prepared me for this, no lesson, no conversation, nothing. Just 2 young people lying in the dark, pretending they understood what they were doing. Finally, Samuel spoke. The weather. Of course. The weather was always safe, I answered. Then we talked about farms, families, horses, crops, anything except the obvious thing. The obvious thing being that we were lying beside each other in the dark. As the hours passed, something shifted. Not dramatically, slowly, like ice melting. The conversation became easier. The pauses became less frightening. I began to hear his real voice. Not the polite church voice, not the careful public voice, his actual voice. He told me about a horse that refused to cooperate during planting season. I laughed. He laughed too. And for a moment, everything felt simple. Just 2 people talking. Nothing more, nothing less. There are things the outside world doesn't see about Amish courtship. It wasn't usually passionate. It wasn't usually rebellious. Most of the time, it was awkward, tender, uncertain. Young people trying to understand themselves without the tools they needed. I didn't know then how much of my confusion came from silence itself. Silence creates empty spaces, and empty spaces fill with fear, or guilt, or misunderstanding. Nobody had ever explained attraction to me, so when I noticed my heart beating faster near him, I didn't know what to call it. When I noticed myself hoping he would visit again, I didn't know what to call that either. I only knew something inside me was changing, and I had no language for it. At some point, his hand found mine beneath the quilt. Very carefully, very slowly, as though he was asking permission without words. I froze for a second. Then I let my hand remain where it was. Neither of us moved after that. We simply stayed there, talking quietly, listening to the house breathe around us. And for the first time in my life, I felt seen in a way I could not fully explain. Not understood completely, just seen. Sometimes there is a difference. Much later, after I left the Amish world, I would learn new words. Words like consent, boundaries, emotional development, communication. Back then, I knew none of them. I only knew that a strange door had opened inside me, and I could not close it again. Near morning, Samuel stood to leave. The room felt colder immediately. He paused near the doorway. Then he asked if he could come back. I said yes. I remember lying awake after he left, watching darkness slowly turn gray outside the window, listening to roosters beginning their morning calls, trying to understand what had happened. I couldn't, not completely. I only knew I was waiting for the next Saturday already, and I didn't know why. Or maybe I did. I just wasn't allowed to say it. The second time Samuel came, the house felt different before he even arrived. Not because anything had changed, because I had changed. A week earlier, I had been afraid. Now, I was waiting. That surprised me. I tried not to think about it during the day. I helped my mother in the kitchen, I hung laundry outside, I gathered eggs. I moved through all the same chores I had done hundreds of times before. But underneath everything was anticipation, a feeling I had no words for. In our community, girls were not encouraged to talk about those feelings. You carried them quietly. like everything else. That evening, the sky turned gray long before sunset. Snow was coming. You could smell it. The air had that sharp winter scent, the kind that makes your nose sting. By the time darkness settled over the fields, flakes were already falling. I remember standing at the window, watching white specks drift through lantern light, wondering if Samuel would still come. Part of me hoped he would. Part of me hoped he wouldn't. Both feelings lived side by side. Eventually, I heard the familiar sound of boots on the porch, and I smiled before I realized I was smiling. That startled me. When he entered my room, there was less awkwardness. Not none, just less. We had crossed some invisible bridge. We knew each other a little now. Enough to move past weather and crops. Enough to talk like people. He told me something that night I never forgot. He said he wasn't sure he wanted to spend his entire life on his father's farm. The words came out slowly, carefully, almost guiltily. In our community, certain thoughts stayed hidden. Dissatisfaction was one of them. Dreams could be dangerous, especially if those dreams pointed beyond the community. I remember turning toward him. Even in the dim light, I could see tension in his face. He was waiting for judgment, or correction, or maybe silence. Instead, I told him something I had never told anyone. I told him that sometimes I sat beside the creek behind our property and wondered what existed beyond the places I already knew. Not because I had a plan, I didn't. Not because I wanted to leave. At least, I didn't think so then. I was simply curious. Curiosity felt dangerous enough. The room became very quiet. Then Samuel asked a question. "You ever think about leaving?" Nobody had ever asked me that before. Not directly. Not honestly. The answer arrived before I could stop it. Everyone thinks about it. Then I paused. Before they stop. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. I still remember that silence. Not uncomfortable, not fearful, just truthful. The kind of silence that happens when two people recognize something in each other, something they have both been carrying alone. That was the first time I understood what bundling could become. Not romance, not even courtship. Sometimes it became a place where truth could breathe. A place where young people could say things they could not say during daylight. Because daylight belonged to expectations. The dark belonged to honesty. As the night continued, we talked about things neither of us discussed anywhere else. Responsibilities, fears, questions, the future. Words that had remained trapped inside us. I think now about how young we were. 17, 19, children in many ways, trying to make sense of lives that already seemed mapped out. I knew what my future was supposed to look like. Marriage, children, church, housekeeping, submission. I had been taught the principle of Gelassenheit, the Amish belief in yielding one's own will, putting community before self, obedience before individuality, humility before personal desire. I accepted those teachings, mostly. But sometimes late at night I wondered something. What happened to the parts of us that did not fit? Nobody seemed eager to answer that question. Near the end of the second night, Samuel kissed me, very lightly, barely more than a touch, a question rather than a statement. I did not pull away. I did not lean forward either. I simply sat there afterward, overwhelmed by feelings I could not identify. Nobody had ever explained attraction. Nobody had ever explained desire. Nobody had explained what happened inside a body when another person mattered. I was expected to understand without being taught. That is a heavy burden for a young person, especially a young girl. After Samuel left, I lay awake until sunrise, again. I remember staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle, listening to winter wind push snow against the windows, wondering whether something was wrong with me. Not because I had done anything wrong, because I felt things I could not name. And unnamed feelings often become frightening. Nobody told me that. I learned it later, years later. The third night came weeks afterward. By then, winter had fully arrived. The fields were white. The trees looked black against the snow. Everything felt quieter during winter, even people. Samuel arrived much later than usual. I had nearly fallen asleep. When I heard his footsteps, something felt different immediately. The sound itself seemed heavier. I could not explain it. Sometimes you simply know. He entered the room, closed the door, and sat silently for a long time. The silence stretched. I waited. Eventually, he spoke. "My father says the farm can't support another household." I knew what that meant. Every Amish child knew. Land was limited. Money was limited. Opportunities were limited. Not every son could inherit enough to build a future. Sometimes entire lives were shaped by those realities. Samuel stared toward the ceiling. I thought I knew what my future looked like. Then he stopped. I waited. Finally, he continued. "Now I'm not sure." I remember feeling a strange ache listening to him, because I understood. Not his exact situation, but the feeling beneath it. The feeling that your life has already been decided before you fully understand yourself. I had carried that feeling for years, maybe longer than I realized. I thought about school ending after 8th grade. I thought about all the books I wanted to read, all the questions I wanted to ask, all the things I quietly wondered about, questions that had nowhere to go. I told him something that night, something I had never said aloud. Sometimes it feels like everyone already knows who we're supposed to become. The room stayed silent. Then Samuel nodded, very slowly. That nod said everything. For hours we talked, not about romance, not about marriage, not about courtship, about uncertainty, about fear, about feeling trapped between duty and curiosity, about trying to be good while still wondering who you might have become somewhere else. Those conversations stayed with me long after Samuel disappeared from my life, because they revealed something important. There were far more doubts inside our community than anyone admitted. People simply learned not to voice them. That is how systems survive, not through answers, through silence. When Samuel left that third night, he stood by the door longer than usual. Then he wished me good night, and he left. He never came back. Months later, I heard he was courting another girl. Life moved forward, at least on the surface. I wasn't heartbroken, not really. What existed between us had never fully become romance. It was something else. Two young people recognizing loneliness in each other. Two young people sharing truths that daylight did not permit. That mattered. Even now it matters. There are things I understand today that I could not understand then. I understand that information is not dangerous. Silence can be. I understand that young people need language for their experiences. They need honest conversations. They need answers. Not because they are rebellious, because they are human. Looking back, I do not remember bundling as romantic. I remember confusion, curiosity, connection, questions. I remember lying awake in darkness trying to understand myself. I remember carrying emotions that nobody had helped me name, and I remember how alone that felt. Years later, when I left the Amish community, the consequences arrived quickly. Maydung, shunning, the practice of separation from those who leave. Phone calls stopped, letters disappeared, relationships changed. Some doors closed, some never reopened. Leaving gave me freedom, it also gave me grief. Both things can be true. People often ask whether I hate the Amish. I don't. That answer surprises some people. There are things I still treasure: the work ethic, the simplicity, the sense of belonging, the smell of fresh bread cooling on a wooden table, the sound of horses moving through morning fog, the quiet of lantern light after sunset. Those memories remain, but so does the silence around bodies, the silence around emotions, the silence around questions. And sometimes I think about that 17-year-old girl staring at wooden beams in the dark, waiting for footsteps, waiting for answers, feeling things she could not explain. I wish someone had simply sat beside her and said one thing: "What you're feeling is normal. You are not wrong. You are not broken. You are not sinful for being human." Nobody told me that, so I am saying it now. Not only for her, for anyone who grew up believing their questions were dangerous. For anyone who learned silence before understanding. For anyone who spent years carrying confusion that never belonged to them. I still think about those 3 nights sometimes. Not because of Samuel, not because of romance, because those nights showed me something important, the difference between tradition and understanding, and how often people mistake one for the other. This is my story. Like, share, and subscribe if you want to hear more real Amish experiences no one else is telling.